Um, Good afternoon. My name is Alan McCoy. I'm Director of Startup Support at University of Maryland's UM Ventures. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who joined us today for the next installment in Startup Fundamentals workshop series, both our live webinar audience and those watching the recorded version on our Startup UMD YouTube channel. This workshop series is offered by UM Ventures at the University of Maryland. To everyone attending the live session, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And if you see that someone else submitted a question that's very similar to yours, you can upvote it, and questions with the most votes will be answered first. The session is recorded, and we will post it on our Startup UMD YouTube channel, so you can submit your questions anonymously if you wish to do so. Also, we are doing this session in a webinar format, so your cameras are not going to be on. So today, our topic is conflict of interest. It's a very interesting and could be somewhat tricky topic. So it's conflict of interest considerations for University of Maryland faculty and staff. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Today's speakers are members of University of Maryland's Conflict of Interest Committee. Dr. Pat O'Shea, who's a professor and chair of Conflict of Interest Committee. Dr. Beth Britton Powell, Director of Research Compliance Initiatives and University of Maryland COI Administrator. Felicia Metz, Associate Director of UM Ventures. Dr. Phil Deschamps, University of Maryland faculty member and former COI Committee Chair. Again, thank you so much for spending your time and your expertise with us. The microphone is yours. I'm going to turn off my camera and mic, and you can take it on. And those in the audience, please keep those questions coming.
Thank you, Ala, for organizing this event, and more importantly, for the great work you do every day in support of our startup community. So I'm Pat O'Shea, the chair of the committee. And when I tell people I'm the chair of the Conflict of Interest Committee, they kind of frown and say, oh, that must be no fun. But it is fun because we are really here to help. And my colleagues and I are really working very hard to support our colleagues as they start companies or engage with companies in the outside world and try to bring their research from theory into practice. And so, we work to say yes. We work to make things happen. 99% of the time we say yes, and less than 1% of the time we say no. And we're not the conflict of interest police. We're really here to help, as I said. And help is very important for the academic community, because many academics are asked to do 4 things in which they have no training formally: teach, manage budgets, manage people, and start companies and work with companies. So we're here to help with the last part of that, the company startup, and the working with companies, and help you avoid conflict of interest. So next slide, please. So we're going to have a brief introduction, talk a little bit about university, state, and federal policies, talk about how we disclose and manage conflict of interest, and then we're going to have some discussion and questions at the end. So where we are today is really in University 4.0. And what is that? It's basically an innovative and entrepreneurial university. So that's where the university is and has been for several years. However, many of us were educated in prior versions of the university. If we would go way back, 1,000 years, it was all about classical education, and the words innovation and originality and research were dangerous words. You could lose your job for being innovative. There was really no research going on. It was very much classical education and not very practical. Then the next phase, starting in the middle of the 19th century, where we introduced practical education, the Land Grant Act in the US, where we had engineering, agriculture, and so forth. And in Europe, similar things were happening. So we moved from classical to practical, but again, very, very little research. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century where the idea of invention, creativity in research universities began to take hold. But as that began to happen, there was a lot of pushback. As the university has sort of gone from one phase to the other, people often push back. A colleague of mine told me that about 60 years ago here at Maryland, some people were pushing back in engineering against the idea of research being used as a criterion for promotion and tenure, because research was considered uncertain and perhaps even dangerous in its outcome, and engineers were supposed to be producing reliable outcomes. So some people were pushing back against research 60 years ago. And so then, over the past decade or more, we've been really focusing on entering the fourth phase, which is the sort of entrepreneurial university, where the universities become engines for innovation. So we take all of the previous versions of the university and roll them into one and work to take our research and convert it into a practical outcome. But like I said, earlier on, there's always been controversy associated with these transitions, because people oftentimes don't know how to behave, and there's often uncertainty. And that's sort of where we are at the moment, because we were all educated mostly in University 3.0, which was basically where it was about educating students, creating knowledge, and disseminating knowledge. And at that time, disseminating knowledge really meant publishing papers and giving talks and so forth. Okay, and about over 13 years ago, we changed our promotion and tenure criteria to add another factor, basically, which relates to entrepreneurship. And so that has resulted in a lot of changes in the university, a lot of increase in working with companies and people starting companies. And, we're all trying to do this and encourage it, the universities, the president, federal agencies, and so forth. And we've been very, very successful in promoting these entrepreneurial activities. You will all have heard of many of the companies whose logos are going to flash up here in a second. IonQ being one of our big recent ones in quantum computing, which is now listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But in making this transition, the key issue we need to focus on is how we deal with the competing interests of working with an outside company or starting an outside company versus our loyalty to the university. And so my colleague Felicia now will go into that and some questions that arise when you're working with an outside company.
Thanks, Pat. So yeah, entrepreneurship, creating companies to help further advance and get products of your research out into the market, into public use, public benefit, is just another way of disseminating our knowledge here at the university and transferring out. I think, Pat's timeline, there was a big change a little over 40 years ago in the Bayh-Dole Act that prompted many universities to change their policies about IP ownership, starting tech transfer offices, starting to license out university research to companies. But I think in the last 10, 15 years, we're in sort of a different phase, and how we're looking at entrepreneurship and companies has changed, and how the university is providing resources around promoting this, I think has also gone through an evolution. But, just getting stuff out there, creating a company, I think it's hard to often manage competing interests that you as a single person might have. So I think a lot of researchers I talk to, your sole focus is on your technology, your research, and everything that happens with that. And whether it's here at the university, through a company, it's hard to see the different interests and think about which hat you're wearing at the time. So if you're considering in a situation what's the university's interest? What's the company's interest? If you have a position in a company, you automatically have certain fiduciary responsibilities to that company. A company is set up to make money, and that often might not align with what the university wants to happen with research and funding. And then as an individual, you might have personal financial interests that get tied up in things. And so if you can't figure out what hat you're wearing at any given moment, that would be a complex and a hard conflict to manage. And so consider, do all of these interests align? And if there are competing interests, they need to be managed. And management avoids misuse of students, it avoids misuse of resources, both university and company, misuse of intellectual property, things that the university has invested in, and avoids potentially biased research results. So really, what is a conflict of interest? Our policy has a definition, a very broad definition, where conflict of interest can occur where members of university community are in a position to gain or appear to gain financial advantage or personal benefit arising from your university positions. And research could be involved, administrative or educational actions, and Maryland public ethics law also applies. So a financial conflict of interest is where an individual exploits or has the potential to exploit their position for personal gain or for profit. And remember too, we're concerned about both actual real conflicts of interest and also if there's a perceived conflict of interest. And whether real or perceived, all of these have to be disclosed and managed so that the integrity of university research programs aren't undermined. So the research bias conflict of interest is where secondary interest might provide an incentive for a researcher to make a judgment that differs from what you might have made otherwise in the absence of that secondary interest.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about mitigating conflict of interest. And this discussion is mostly going to be centered around financial conflict of interest. I mean, Felicia mentioned research bias, but it turns out the vast majority of things we see relate to financial conflict of interest as opposed to creating bias in research. And that's not just true here at the university, but more broadly across the country. So, the typical sort of primary relationship that we might have, say, with a company, if let's say a company was funding research at the university, right? Initially, the faculty member has no other relationship with the company, but the company funds some research through the university. Let's say money comes in through Aura. That's well monitored, legal, transparent, unbiased, and objective because it's part of the normal system that we've had at the university for monitoring external funding. Complications then can arise when there is some kind of a secondary relationship between the company and the faculty member. Secondary relationships are allowed, but complications can arise, and that's where things have to be managed. And the secondary relationship could be, one is a consultant for a company, one might be an equity owner of a company, a family member might own equity in a company, or a family member might be an employee, or one of one's students, for example, could be an employee of the company, or also one might separately, for example, be receiving gifts from the company. I mean, many faculty receive gifts from companies, and we allow that, but that has to be managed and disclosed. And what can happen here is there is a potentiality, a perception, or maybe an actuality of that secondary relationship not being transparent, not being monitored, and create a secondary incentive for behavior, misuse of university facilities and people, and also potentially being biased. And so that's why when somebody has a secondary relationship, with an outside entity. We want it to be basically disclosed, discussed, and managed. So, you know, we all have conflicts of interest of some sort, and the key to success is disclosure, discussion, and management. And as I said at the beginning, 99% of the time we say absolutely yes, and you know, in cases where there are some conflicts, we work to manage them the vast majority of the time. Okay, so
I
now,
did want to add real quick, just a reminder about gifts, that if a company is giving you a gift, there should be no conditions, no strings attached. But I think often there's an expectation that you might want then the university to give them something in exchange so that they keep giving you more gifts. And so, you know, things like free licenses or funneling university IP to that company because you're giving gifts, the two can't be connected. That would undermine what a gift is. The company would run afoul of tax implications and things like that. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. And if it's really money that's sponsoring research, I would highly recommend going sponsored research route instead of gift route.
yeah, because we have had problems in the past where things happened where they weren't transparently disclosed, discussed, and monitored. So I want to talk briefly about our conflict of interest and conflict of commitment policies, which we hadn't discussed. Basically, these policies apply to all university employees, faculty, staff, you know, everybody who's working at the university. So conflict of interest, we've talked about, typically involves financial gain and also possibly research bias. Conflict of commitment is slightly different, and we're really not going to talk about that, but that really means if one is engaged in some meritorious outside activity, but spending, you know, too much time on the activity, that can impair one's ability to get one's basic job done. So the Conflict of Interest Committee doesn't deal with conflict of commitment. That's handled through the consulting policy, and there are limits on how much time one can spend working with outside entities like companies, and like I said, that's part of the consulting policy. So one important thing to remember is that we are state employees, so Maryland state ethics law applies. Now, you may have conversations with people who work at private universities, and they may say, oh, at, you know, other universities, certain things are allowed, but we're subject not just to university policy, but the state regulations and law, and of course, federal law as well. Now, the good news about managing conflict of interest is that we have special authority from the state to manage research and development related conflict of interest matters. So if one has an outside engagement with a company and it's related to one's research in some way, state law allows us, the Conflict of Interest Committee and the system as a whole, to manage that internally. Okay, but so we have, you know, delegated authority from the state to develop our own policies and to manage it. However, one should remember that a violation of university policy automatically becomes a violation of state law and possibly federal regulations, as we get into in a little bit. And our goal in all of this is to help you manage R&D related COIs and make sure you don't get in trouble, basically.
And keep your funding.
And keep your funding. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can and do happen. So some examples of the state of Maryland's COI provisions, you know, as I like to say to people, we read the state law so you don't have to, but we'll give you some examples of the kinds of things that the state of Maryland law does not allow. And the first one is that an employee may not participate in an official action, decision, or matter in circumstance where the employee or close relatives have an outside financial interest. So, for example, you know, if I own stock in a major company and I start encouraging the university to buy that company's products, that's an example of a conflict of interest, or if I own a company, I try to encourage the university to buy my products. That's an example of that kind of conflict of interest. The next one relates to bias, basically where the secondary employment or financial interest would impair the impartiality or independence of judgment. And the other is engaging in activities that would result in the misuse of university students or employees for the benefit of outside entities and for the employee in other ways. So, if one is hiring students or hiring university employees in one's outside company, one has to be very careful in their rules and regulations about that to prevent misuse of employees or students for personal benefit. And the solicitation of gifts, Felicia has already mentioned that. So you're not allowed to solicit personal gifts, and we sort of view that not just one personally outside the university, but all inside the university from individuals who are doing or are seeking to do business with the university. Okay, so as Felicia said, if you've got some other relationship with a company and you're trying to get gifts from them, that is something that has to be disclosed, discussed, and managed. Okay, but we are very careful not to stop people from getting gifts, but to make sure that gifts are disclosed, discussed, and the relationship is properly managed to make sure it doesn't violate any state regulations. So these are just some examples, some of the key examples that are relevant here to us in the university, but there's a term that's used in state law, which is misuse of prestige of office. So we all have prestige of office because of our positions here at the university, and we have to be very careful not to use that prestige to engage in outside of activities which would violate any of these things that we have here. So let's just, on the next slide, I want to talk briefly about...
Real quick though, Pat, I think what's good though is, yes, there's kind of all these prohibitions as state employees, but what's good is that the state has recognized the importance of conducting additional research and development activities that might give rise to other conflicts and things that might otherwise violate these state ethics law provisions. So as long as we're following the provisions of the research and development exemptions, which includes following our campus COI policy, which starts with disclosure. If you're disclosing, things are managed, then we're good and the activity can proceed. And so that, I think, transitions into then what is our process and how we apply our policy.
Right, exactly. So we basically then, like I've said all along, we assist our colleagues engaging responsibly in outside research and development related activities. And as I said, we have delegated authority from the state, which allows us to do that. And at certain things which would be prohibited for other state employees are allowed if disclosed and appropriately managed. Okay, so very dangerous thing if one decides in one's own head that, oh, I can manage this conflict. No, it has to be disclosed and appropriately managed in a formal way. Okay, and that is the key point, is that certain conflicts are allowed, as Felicia said, but they have to be disclosed and appropriately managed. The state exemption is only for research-related conflicts of interest. If there's some other type of conflict of interest that's not research-related, that is handled directly by the State Ethics Commission. The COI committee has no role in that, and any employee who wants to get an exemption from state regulations for a non-research and development related activity would have to apply directly to the State Ethics Commission. We work very hard to use our broad R&D exemption to manage things, but there have been cases where the thing is the outside of activity is not R&D related, and therefore it's dealt with directly by the State Ethics Commission. And we can provide some advice on that if people have any particular questions. Okay, so I think you're next, Beth.
Thanks, Pat.
Something a bit about the federal regulations, which is complicated to say the least.
Thanks, Pat. So this last year has seen a lot of changes and federal guidelines with regard to conflict of interest and what needs to be disclosed. In general, we're seeing more of an alignment across agencies. And that alignment is that disclosures need to be made to your university at the time of proposal. We're starting to see that. We see that with PHS. We see that with DOE. NASA is starting to bring that on board. So again, there is an alignment going on. What we do is we urge everyone, if you have questions, so we're seeing some very detailed types of questions in the Q&A, is to actually contact COI and set up a meeting. Most of the week we spend talking to people like you, getting more information about what you want to do and giving advice on how you can or cannot do what you want to do. And when we say things like, well, you can't really do that, our job is to help you work through that and figure out whether there is a way forward. So our job isn't, as most research administrators on the call will agree with, our job isn't to say no. Our job is to say it depends and try to see if we can help you work towards a solution. So we really appreciate those that reach out to us. The other thing that, oops, I moved the wrong slide. The other thing that we're trying to do is, because the COI regulations are changing so quickly, we are trying to come up with a crosswalk that shows you the question by agency. And again, what we're pointing out in this one in particular is that many of the agencies are moving towards this requirement of a disclosure with your university. They assume if you've told them about a potential conflict or an outside activity that you're doing, that you've also told us. It is our job as the University of Maryland College Park to look at your disclosures. And again, as we keep saying over and over and over again, our job really is to have you discuss with you what it is that you want to do, what you've disclosed, and then help you manage that any potential conflicts that may arise. The other thing that we want to remind you of is that as state employees, we are responsible to the state. There are state laws and policies that we have to follow. There are university policies we have to follow, and then there are federal guidelines. And no, they do not always align. We try very hard to make it as easy for the researchers as possible. We understand it is a burden on you. It is not a burden that we as university employees are putting on you. These are federal guidelines passed down to the university that are required. And so while it may seem overwhelming, our job again is to really talk with you and to help you reach a solution. So the first step is simple. You just need to disclose. So what does it mean to disclose? So about 1.5 years ago, we went from paper forms to an online system. We call it KCOI. COI is our system of record for proposals that go out the door. The COI system also has a COI module that we use. So KCOI stands for COI conflict of interest. So the question that we often get is, well, when do I have to do this? Well, honestly, when you're in doubt, disclose. There's no reason not to disclose information. One of the things that we are hoping in the next year will happen is that the outside activities report will be melded into COI, so you won't be inputting information into two different systems. We're hoping to combine another system. But right now, disclosures as far as the COI policy are concerned, every University of Maryland employee is required to follow the COI policy. Disclosures are required when you have a new significant financial interest. So faculty and staff, researchers who are involved in sponsored projects need to disclose. If you have a new outside activity, then you should be updating a disclosure if you have one on file. If you don't have one on file, you should then be disclosing for the first time. And for many, when you are submitting to external agencies, foundations, or to a program like the MIPS program, the Maryland Industrial Partnerships Program, most of the MIPS proposals that we see are with a faculty member's own company. So in that case, there is definitely a potential for a conflict of interest that needs to be managed. So all MIPS proposals should be going through a conflict of interest review. And in general, we really want you to be as transparent as you can be in the disclosure. The more details that you provide, the fewer iterations. So what happens, I'll explain that a little more in the next slide.
And the disclosures, it's confidential. Disclosing isn't like any admission of wrongdoing or anything like that. It's just you're giving facts to the appropriate office so that we can help manage any potential conflicts.
And what Felicia said is really important. Having a conflict isn't necessarily a problem. Having an unmanaged and undisclosed conflict, that's a problem. So that's why we say, talk to us. If you're not sure whether you need to disclose or not, reach out to the COI office. We set up Zoom meetings. We're willing to talk you through it. If you have trouble with the disclosure itself and not sure what to answer, we help you with that as well. We really are a customer service oriented office. You are our customer. Our job is to help you get through the process.
And don't make the decision yourself that you don't have a conflict. Disclose, and then the office will evaluate.
Exactly. So that actually brings us to what are the roles and responsibilities. That was a perfect segue, Felicia. So as a faculty member or as a researcher, your responsibility is to disclose, to be honest and complete in that disclosure and include all the relevant information that is required for us to review it for a potential conflict. We already talked about that the COI system is planning to merge with OPA within the next year. That will reduce the number of systems that you are reporting in. Like I reported to this one, I don't remember if I reported it to that one. Our job is to help you make sure that you've reported what you need to report. After you have disclosed, it goes to your chair and your unit head, and then it goes to your dean. Their role and responsibility is thoughtful triage. They review it for the information because they have a lot more situational awareness than we do in the COI office. So their job is to look at it and make determinations as they're reviewing, like, do they believe that the COI could be eliminated? If not, is this activity necessary and important? And if you have provided a draft management plan, is it reasonable? But we want to remind you that the chair, the unit head, and the dean are only reviewing. They're not saying whether there is or is not a COI. They are not approving a COI management plan. Once it goes through their review, they basically are letting us know, as far as they know, all the information that they're aware of has been provided in the disclosure. They let us know if they have any questions. That's the point it may come back to you as a disclosure that you may need to provide some additional information. What we do as that office is once it goes through those reviews, it routes to our office. Our office reviews, make sure that nothing is left out. We also are in the process of updating our form based on really great feedback that the users have provided to make the form more user-friendly. But our job is to make sure that if all the questions are answered, that there's entity information. We look at it to see whether, as an office, we think that there is a conflict or not, or whether it needs to go to the COI committee. COI committee is about 15 people, faculty members and researchers like yourself who sit on the committee, as well as some administrators from Aura, from UM Ventures, from procurement, who then look at your disclosure and help you attempt to create a management plan. So our job is the advanced triage section. And we review the plans as you have provided. We actually help develop the plans and we ensure compliance with the policies. The most important part of our job is that we make a recommendation. The COI committee is also not an approval committee. We are a recommending committee. The only person on campus that can approve a COI management plan is the president. So the COI committee or the COI office makes a recommendation. It is reviewed by the vice president for research and then sent to the president's office for review. Again, President Pines is currently the only person on campus who can approve a COI management plan. The process for disclosure can take a while. So routing, even electronically, can take 2 to 3 weeks. So when you first disclose and you submit in KCOI, it routes immediately to your unit head. Your unit head and dean, it can take up to 2 weeks for the routing to go through them. It then, like I said, comes to our office where we do another triage. At this point, again, maybe where it comes back to you for additional revisions. If the revisions are significant, I'm really sorry to tell you that it will have to go back through routing. Anything that is a significant change, we feel that the chair or the dean should see, it will reroute. Once it comes to committee review, it can take up to 6 to 8 weeks from the time you disclose to get through committee review. The committee meets once a month. We meet the second Wednesday of every month except for August. And so in order for it to be considered for an agenda, your disclosure has to be routed, reviewed, and ready for the committee by the beginning of the month, the first day of the month. The committee may have questions and may need to go back for revision again. If the committee agrees that it can move forward, again, the letters have to be written with the recommendations that then go to the president for signature. So again, this can all take an extended period of time. What we ask is if you have an award pending, if you have a gift pending, if you have a sabbatical or a leave without pay, contact the COI office and let us know that you have a time-sensitive matter. We will try to move you up in the queue. After the president has approved, you get your disposition, and then we notify you. Every disclosure gets a notification from the COI office. If you disclose and you answer no to every question, you get an automatic reply that says you've been auto-approved because you answered no to everything. If you answer yes to any question, some person in the COI office has to put eyes on your disclosure. And if we view it as a no COI, you'll get a no COI memo. It'll be uploaded into KCOI. It will also be emailed to you. The same thing with your management plan. So why does it take COI so long? We get this question a lot. We went from last year, from January until last June, as an office of Pat and I, and Phil when he would answer our phone calls. And last June, we added a person and a half, and then this past February added a third person. So we are office of 3.5. The reason that it takes so long is since November of 2021, we've received almost 1,300 disclosures. This is almost 6 times the number that we would have received in a single year before we went to an electronic version. And so we have, as of earlier this week, dispositioned almost 1,100. We have 170 that are outstanding, that are actively in our office being reviewed or routing. So this is just a breakdown to give you an idea of what we're looking at. Revising these means that they have been sent back to the researchers and they are in revision. Reviewing means these are actively ready for the office to take forward, and routing means that they are still with your chair or dean. You can always contact COI and ask the status of your disclosure. We are happy to do that. In the routing process, again, just to alleviate that it's going to get stuck somewhere, just so you know, every 3 to 5 days we check the routing, and if it is not moved, we contact the person where it is to let them know that it is still ready for their review. The breakdown is interesting. So breakdown across campus, CM&S, BSOS, and engineering are the largest disclosers on campus. VPR, because of our list, is also a very large disclosure. But to put your mind at ease, so of these almost 1,300 that have come in, this large green spot, these are auto approves. Everybody who had to go in said no to every question. They don't have equity, they don't have a company, they don't consult, they don't travel. So these are all the auto approves. This lighter green is the no COI that has been reviewed. This means somebody put eyes on it, whether it was our office or the COI committee, and they said that there was no conflict of interest. Only this small portion, so it's about 50 management plans that we have, where we have said there is a potential conflict or there is a conflict that needs to be managed. Of those, the blue are the unmanageable. We have said no maybe 12 times out of 1,300 disclosures. So again, just to let you know, when we say no, our no is no, this is unmanageable as you have disclosed it. The next step is to have a meeting and discuss it with you, to talk through what were the committee's concerns, what are the COI office's concerns, talk with you, your chair, if necessary, to try to figure out a way forward. A lot of these times that we're saying no is when You have a sponsored or research agreement with a company and you want to consult for the company. If you've disclosed that, that's an unmanageable situation. You have to either choose the sponsored agreement or the consulting. So that's when there's a dual relationship is when we mostly see unmanageable disclosures.
Beth, there are a couple of questions in the chat about disclosing stipends, honorariums. I think generally the answer should be yes, disclose those things.
Yes. So also, as you're disclosing, we do ask some conflict of commitment questions. And there are some agencies that require you to disclose honorarium. So that's why the questions are on there. And so we do ask that you do that. If you have questions, please always reach out. We are happy to talk you through it and say whether we think you need to or not. But we go back to our best practice is when in doubt, disclose.
There's also a question about what is a significant financial interest. I think for universities policy, you need to disclose any financial interest.
Yes. So when you look at agency policies, agencies may say $5,000 or more, $10,000 or more. The state is $0. That is our limit. So you need to disclose everything. If you have stocks, so you have TIA CREF and you have if you do what I do, you're like, yeah, 20%, 30%, whatever, go do it. And you have no active control over it. You do not need to disclose those. It's only the ones you have active control over or active involvement in.
Right. And in regard to stipends, federal regulations distinguish between U.S. entities and foreign entities. So if you get your travel paid by a U.S. university, that's disclosable to us, but not to most federal agencies. But if you get that from a foreign university, it is disclosable to federal agencies. So that's a bit confusing. So if in doubt, disclose, as has been said before.
So transitioning a little bit to specific interactions with companies, and there's also a couple of questions about having equity in a company. One question is, how much equity can a faculty own in their startup? The university doesn't have a rule about that. You can own 100% of a company, you can own 5% of a company. If you need advice and guidance on if you are creating a company and you're getting investors and what makes sense and what's reasonable for how much you hold in the company, you need to talk to some outside advisors, starting with some of the entrepreneurs in residence that we have. You can make an appointment with them through ALA and the UM Ventures. We have a link for making appointments. That might be a good place to start to get advice. So whether you're faculty or grad assistants, doesn't matter. There were a couple questions too about faculty member having equity in a company who sponsors research in their labs. Yes, you can have equity in a company that's also sponsoring research in your labs, but I think what the management plan will be very fact specific for what this relationship looks like. So start with disclosing, and then we'll work with figuring out what the appropriate management plan is. And there was another question about consulting with a company who also sponsors research in your lab. That relationship can't happen at the same time. So you might have consulted for a company 5 years ago, and now they're, because of the relationship, they're coming to you to sponsor research. If your consulting has ended, then it's fine that they're sponsoring research. And then if you want to consult with them again, wait till your research project through the university is over to start that consulting relationship. But again, there could be some nuances that are fact specific, so please disclose. We'll get that arranged. Let me just see if there's any other questions relevant to this. So moving on with interactions with companies, the university sees the value with working with companies, having them sponsor research here, licensing our IP to these companies who can further de-risk a technology, develop it. And so starting companies, which my office UM Ventures is involved a great deal with, is one really great way to help de-risk very early stage technologies and research that you're working on here at the university. get them in better shape for further licensing, acquisition by a larger, more established company, lots of different paths to commercialization. And so I think the university now is encouraging of starting companies to develop university research. So your company certainly can, and I put company here in bold because remember, it's the company doing these things, not you individually. So your company can certainly license IP from the university, can hire students from the university, rent space on campus, have a prime sub relationship between the university and the company. But there certainly could be constraints in place in order to manage the relationship and mitigate COIs. So it's best to, if you're forming a company, disclose at the time you're forming it. I think it used to be advice that was given was wait until there's some research relationship between the company and the university. But at this point, I would say it's best practice to disclose as soon as you form the company. Might have equity in the company, it might be worth nothing, but disclose it so that there's a record of it. And then as things change, if you shut down the company, if then say your company is getting an SBIR, STTR award, and you want to work back with the university, then that would be the type of relationship or instance that would need to be updated. So from the university side too, when you're part of a company, you can certainly disclose the relationship. If you're just planning a startup and it hasn't been formed yet, you can still serve as the PI on, for example, a TEDCO MII Tech Assessment Award. And this is where you're contemplating a company, and the first phase is funding $115,000 that comes to the university as a proof of concept fund to see if then this technology would be a good fit to license to a startup or an established company. And you can certainly work on creating university IP that you might have something in your mind might eventually get licensed by the university to a company. And from the company side, hire professional management. We certainly want that to happen so that you can focus on your university responsibilities where that's needed. So hire professional management. The company can certainly apply for other funding, SBIR, STTR, seek investment, obtain physical space at the university separate from your lab. That's really important too. And the company can also apply for additional funding from TEDCO for the company formation piece. Next slide. So some of the challenges. So competing goals exist, and we need to help you balance your university research interests with company and personal financial goals. So what you can't do when you're both university personnel and associated with the company. So some specific examples, you can't be the PI on both sides of a proposal. That's a type of self-dealing, but there's a solution. So pick a side for an individual project. Be the PI here at the university and have somebody else on the company side be the PI there, but you can't be both. You can't have your current advisees or lab personnel, people who report to you here at the university, also work in your company. And so a solution is to have separate concurrent reporting lines. Have somebody else advise them, have somebody else do their performance evaluations here at the university, or vice versa. Similarly, students who are currently in your classes can't also work in your company if you have one. And so the solution though is wait till they're no longer your students to hire them. I mean, we certainly recognize the value in having students work at companies and getting that experiential and real world experience. But there is a potential for abuse and misuse of students if they work for you at your company and you're also deciding what their grades are. You know, you could imagine a situation where they make a mistake, screw up on one side, and you punish them on the other side. And so we want to keep those relationships separate. Similarly, you can't serve on the thesis or dissertation committee of a student as a voting member if that student also works at your company. And the solution is to avoid the concurrent arrangement. I think that's very clear. Also, you can't commingle your university lab and company activities. Remember that as a university personnel, you have an employer. The university pays for a lot of things. We have different liabilities that we're responsible for our space and other things. Keep things as separate as possible. And so solution, keep your space, your people, and project tasks separate. Also can't give the university gifts, internships, etc., to benefit your own research, but the solution is to fund research through proper channels. You also can't negotiate with the university on behalf of the company, and the solution is to have outside counsel or another corporate officer handle that negotiation. So, you know, it might feel like you're being told, no, you can't do X, Y, and Z, but we certainly tried. We've seen almost every scenario, and we'll work to a solution and provide recommendations to help manage. If you're not willing to take the recommendations, not willing to stop certain activities, that might be where there's an unmanageable conflict. So mitigating these conflicts, again, conflicts can arise and intersect where there's a familial relationship, endorsements for companies. Remember too, the university now has an endorsement policy. If you're receiving gifts, creating IP that's being licensed, using university facilities, consulting, procuring from a company. We know that the conflict itself might not be eliminated, but we can mitigate by eliminating the incentive bias, and that might be, as an example, you give up equity in the company. We might work to help just reduce the incentive bias to an acceptably low level. What that might be, I think, is fact specific given the situation. We can manage the consequences of the incentive bias, and that would be through a management plan. So often there's an individual oversight official or a committee for especially complex situations. And I put in the Q&A as answered, the COI office has some example management plans to give you a starting point on the website. You can look at those and make an appointment to talk more about specifics. And so while some conflicts can't entirely be avoided or removed, as long as they're mitigated and managed, then the project, whatever is happening, can proceed. And so full disclosure of all interests has to get made. We want to monitor the research, remove a person with a conflict from crucial steps and decision making if that helps resolve. But where your duties to a company and duties to the university absolutely can't align, though I think in most situations we can come to some appropriate relationship, but where they can't align, that's where there's an unmanageable conflict. And so an ultimate way of eliminating, removing the conflict might be either to step down from your fiduciary role in the company or ultimately leave the university, which I think we don't want to happen, but that might be the ultimate solution, and it makes sense. Let me see if there's any other questions related to that.
There was a question about MOUs. So just so people understand, when the new interim consulting policy went into place last fall, it codified that we have 1 day, full-time employees have 1 day a week to consult. Working for your startup company counts as consulting. So you are, limited to that 1 day. We spoke with someone this morning who was working with their company. They have an SBIR. They had disclosed that they're doing 15 to 20 hours a week. And we had to talk with them about how that would have to be reduced to be in compliance with the consulting policy. Along with the consulting policy also comes the MOU. So there's a memorandum of understanding that has to be signed. Basically, what you're doing is going into a different electronic system, and it's almost, you're basically disclosing a conflict of commitment. You're letting your chair know that you're going to be working for this, you're going to be consulting for another company or for your own company. what you're going to be doing and how many hours you're going to be doing it. It is reviewed at your chair level for a conflict of commitment. That is done by the chair. That is not done by the COI committee. And then it is reviewed by your next level administrator. Once that MOU is finalized and approved, that is when the COI committee and the COI office then finishes the disposition of your COI disclosure. And so I just put in the link, a link for that in the chat. It links to both the electronic system and discusses more FAQs with regard to the consulting policy.
There's a question, can a faculty member collect royalties and own equity in a startup? It depends. The current interim COI policy has a provision that if you have an interest in a company, in order to mitigate that financial conflict of interest, that you have to choose whether you're getting equity from a company or receiving your revenue distribution as a university inventor or creator as set out in our IP policy, or you can talk to UM Ventures and we can arrange an alternate. So it depends.
And there's a question about how long it takes. Yeah, if one is submitting a proposal, and if it's going to take 6 weeks to get a COI disposition, is that a problem? Well, most agencies say you just have to disclose. They don't say that it has to be resolved, right, Beth?
Correct. Only I think it's DOE, ARPA-E requires that you actually have a finalized management plan. So you have to read your funding announcement very clearly. Some of the defense agencies are requiring that it be managed at the time of proposal so that they're, for lack of a better word, not wasting their time on something the university won't allow to go through. But again, this is why, so I did a lot of proposal development before moving into the COI office. I always want to be part of the team. So the COI office also wants to be part of your team. If you have questions as you're putting the proposal together, we are happy to talk through with you before you actually put it in. We've had this happen for a few cases now where a proposal was about 3 weeks about ready to go out the door. They contacted us and we talked through some very large issues that were in the proposal. And so we were able to help them change or reevaluate how they were going to write some aspects of the proposal based on the fact that how they had it, it would have been an unmanageable conflict. So having discussions with us beforehand, we're always open to that. But as Pat said, for most of the federal agencies, you are only required to have a disclosure on file. It doesn't have to be finalized before you actually put the proposal in.
So there's a question, is it okay for a faculty member to own equity in a company who also sponsors research in their lab? Short answer is yes, but there will be certain constraints to that, and that relationship has to be managed. So you start with disclosing, and then an appropriate management plan is put in place to make sure that's managed. And it might be, part of that might be having an oversight official or committee, depending on what's happening. Also, everybody who works in your lab would need to be notified and have resources made available to them if they think an issue comes up so that everyone's aware of your conflict. And there might be some other provisions and constraints in place too. But yes, it's not a yes or no answer. I think it's yes, but with some constraints.
There was also a follow-up question on one of the questions answered. The follow-up question was, what about graduate students? Can graduate students have equity in their faculty members' company? So graduate students and postdocs, we can have discussions. We would suggest before doing it that you contact Pat or the COI office to set up a meeting to discuss, because it does make it more difficult to help create a management plan when your student has equity in a company with you. There would be some things that we as a COI committee would require. For example, that the graduate student could have equity, but could not be doing things on the company side until they graduate, those kinds of things. So we would definitely suggest anytime that you're looking to involve lab members in your company that you contact the COI office first to have a discussion so we can work through with you.
Right. And issues often arise in the very early stages of startup, where the company may not have any other employees. So, we do look at some temporary arrangements that can be allowed for short periods of time that will allow employees or students to get something going, but then there would be a time limit on that, because we understand the difficulty of getting a company started when there's no money and no resources to have other people do stuff. But we have to be careful about allowing such relationships to continue beyond a certain period of time, because the conflicts could evolve into being unmanageable if we're not careful.
One of the other questions that was asked was about familial relationships, spouse or other relations. We do allow we have management plans for familial relationships, whether you're co-PIs, whether you're COI and a PI, all those situations, we do review those. We typically have an oversight official, as Felicia had mentioned earlier, that would be responsible for reviewing all the accounting. We're very careful, and a lot of the federal agencies are really looking into couples that travel together on grant awards and grant funding. And so our job is to protect you and protect the university. That is what those management plans are for. They may seem onerous. We really try not to make them onerous, but we want you to remember our job really is to protect you and protect the university. So that's why we put the management plans in place.
Right. And there's often a question, what constitutes a familial relationship? And it's defined, in university policy. It's basically all the way up to grandparents, down to grandchildren, and then sideways to siblings and uncles and aunts, and spouse, obviously. I think that's about the limit. So distant cousins don't count. Okay.
Since we were talking about equity too, just to comment, the focus of this talk is on individual conflict of interest. University, though, also has an institutional conflict of interest policy. So where the university itself has equity in a company that you form, which we would often get through as consideration in a licensing arrangement. The university itself has a conflict, and there's a committee and a whole process that manages that as well.
So one other thing we want to mention, so I talked a little bit about the outside professional activities report and COI. We want you guys to understand that for right now, they are separate systems. So just because you disclose an OPA, COI, you still have to disclose in COI. They don't talk to each other. The systems don't talk to each other, which is why we've spent the last year and a half working towards a combined system. But for now, if you have disclosed something in OPA, please make sure that you're also disclosing that in KCOI.
And also the faculty activity reports, or as it's now called, faculty success, we don't see that in the conflict of interest committee. So if you've mentioned an activity in your faculty report, that's not good enough, because we don't see that for conflict of interest purposes.
So we've been asked, can we talk a little bit about conflict of time, conflict of commitment? And so I don't know whether it just says, can we talk a little bit about it? There isn't more specificity.
I guess, it depends on the type of activity. According to the, consulting policy, you're allowed 8 hours a week for something that's deemed consulting, right? The chair and dean are the sort of deciders on whether something is consulting or just a normal faculty activity. So, for example, serving on an NSF review panel is not consulting. Okay, that's a normal faculty activity, or on a review panel at another university, that's not consulting. So if an activity is considered a normal faculty activity, it is unlimited by the consulting policy. However, once chair and dean might conclude that one was spending too much time on some activities. So outside activities are constrained. Like I said, if it's consulting, it's 8 hours a week. If you want to do more than 8 hours in 1 week, you can do so with the permission of your chair and dean. And the normal outside faculty activities are not specifically limited. However, if they became so extensive as to impair one's ability to get work done at the university, one's chair or dean could limit that. The other thing that's important is when faculty members go on sabbatical or leave without pay, the sort of rules and regulations still apply. So faculty going on sabbatical and leave without pay have to file conflict of interest disclosures, and the leave without pay and sabbatical will not be approved without a disclosure.
So the other thing to remind everyone of is once you're in the KCOI system, you can update and revise at any time. The expectation, according to federal regulations and university policy, is that you are updating within 30 days of any significant change in what you've disclosed. You get a new outside activity, you take on something new, that you would revise your disclosure to include that. The other thing is if you have nothing that has changed, the quality system will notify you 8 weeks before it expires. So these are annual disclosures. You have to update these annually. Your management plans now run, if you have a management plan, run on an annual cycle. And so 8 weeks out, you'll start getting quality notifications that say it's time to start updating your KCOI disclosure. We do have a link in with Aura. We talk with Ala a lot. We sit on the facilities use application process. We are part of gifts and grants. We talk to Felicia probably more than she wants us to. But all of those things are entwined within COI. COI has a piece of each of those things. So question was asked earlier about gifts. Research gifts have to go through a COI review, every research gift. So if you get amendments and additional money every year, you have to let us know every year. Again, these are things that have to be provided to some federal agencies. So the expectation again is that you are telling us about them. They also have to go through the gift versus grant review. So there's a grant route, a gift routing system as well. The two work together. So anything that you have to do, one question was, do you do them serially or in parallel? Do them in parallel. So if you have to do a consulting MOU and you know you have to do your COI, do them at the same time. So they're routing through the same process. You're not waiting on one thing to approve the next thing. Same thing with the FUA. If you've let Ala know, Ala lets us know, we check to see if you have a COI disclosure on file or whether it needs to be updated. Same thing with gifts. So all these things can be done in parallel.
Right. And it's also a good idea to have a discussion with your chair, immediately before a disclosure, so they're aware that something is coming, and particularly if it might be complex or might be urgent. It's best to have a discussion or send an email to your chair and say, look, this is coming, and that you'd be happy to talk about it more. But sometimes the chairs, the first thing they hear about something is an electronic submission, and it's always good to have a direct communication with your chair, director, or dean to let them know what you're doing.
There's a question about, is writing a book using university resources considered a COI? The first policy that's implicated with this question is the IP policy. And so I would have more questions. I'd want to know, are you faculty? Are you staff? Is this a traditional scholarly work? What resources are you using? And the IP policy then would outline who owns the rights in that book that you're writing. And so if you still have questions about that, please contact me separately and I can help give you a disposition and give some advice on what is appropriate use of resources for this sort of activity.
And I have one comment that needs to be made about emeritus faculty. If you are actually an emeritus faculty member, that is a university title. And you are still expected to file conflicts of KCOI disclosures if you have activities that then somehow intersect with the university. So I still have some research money on campus. I'm working with people, but I'm emeritus and retired. I'm not getting paid a salary by the university, at least not by my department, let's put it that way. And I still have to file KCOI because I have conflicts of interest because I have these commitments with companies and other things. So emeritus, just because you're emeritus doesn't mean that you're separated from this. So you might tell your colleagues who are emeritus, if you're not associated with the campus, it's probably not going to be a problem. So if I got hired by somebody as a consultant, but I was not associated with the campus, that probably would not be the same. But I would encourage you to call the office and just think about this as you're consulting, because that's going to be one that you still have to worry about filing COI under certain circumstances, as I learned the hard way.
I think we've answered all the questions that have been submitted. Do we want to see if there are others or anyone wants to come and ask a live question?
Yeah, at this point, if you would like to raise your hand digitally, so at the bottom of your screen, if you mouse over, you'll see raise hand button. You can click that and we can unmute your mic so you can ask your question that way if you wish to do so. But in the meanwhile, while we are waiting for somebody to raise their hand, I know that a facility use application or FUA has been mentioned several times. So just wanted to reiterate that. So if you have a startup company or any other company, for example, that's sponsoring your research, sponsoring research activities, if that company wants to be on campus and do work in a university space, they need facility use application. They need to go through facility use application process and receive facility use license. So that's true for startup companies that want to go into incubator space here on campus. We manage this process. COI is part of it. So I encourage everybody to submit your COI disclosure as early as possible if you plan to launch a company and if you plan to locate that company on campus. Please submit that FUA as early as you can, COI as early as you can. And facility use application is a separate topic that we will discuss later, but I just wanted to mention that any company coming on campus, even the ones that are sponsoring research in your lab, if they want to come and be on campus, do work in the labs, they need facility use license.
Similar to if you form a company and your company needs to use specialized equipment you have in your lab, you need appropriate permissions for that as well. And so please reach out and find out what the process is for that.
Yeah, but again, the answer isn't no. The answer is we have to follow the proper channels to make sure that IP ownership is proper and everything else is protected, and there's no intermingling of IP, and because there are many other implications. So my role is to support startup activities. I'm not, I'm trying to navigate. We are a big state institution. We have to follow, like Pat said, university policies, state laws. It's a lot sometimes. So my job is to help you navigate those and interacting with the COI committee. And I can attest that this committee acts and responds very promptly. And they are willing to work with most situations and try to find a solution rather than saying no. So thank you for being flexible. Thank you for extending your time. And this training is an example of the committee's willingness to come and educate everybody on campus to make sure that you understand what the rules and regulations are, and make sure that your research cannot be questioned and your research or startup activities cannot be questioned by anyone. We will be, I think Beth already answered the question about circulating the slides. We won't be circulating the slides just because they can be confusing, but we will be circulating a handout with a summary of all of the information that was provided. I can also provide the links that were posted in the chat, but if you'd like to go in now and copy and paste those links, you can, or I will send an email with all of the links that we provided just because it's a lot. You can also access startupguide.umd.edu. It's a guide on how to do a startup if you are a University of Maryland faculty or research or graduate student. There's a lot of information and step-by-step when and what to do. So if there are there any more questions? I don't see any raised hands. Let's see. If there are no more questions, but you think of a question later, please feel free to contact the COI committee at coi@umd.edu, or you can send me an email and I can connect you with an appropriate person. And we will be posting the recorded version of this on Startup UMD YouTube channel, so you can review it there again if you wish to do so. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pat, Beth, Felicia, Bill, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. I hope that this was useful for everybody in attendance. And we will repeat this session again in about a year or so that if there are any updates or anything like that, we can cover them then. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended and participated. Thank you for great questions. And please feel free to keep them coming if you have them. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alla, for everything you did to organize this.
Thanks. See you.